Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Maybe for some, it's night time. It's a good night as well. My name is Bhargavi Davar. I'm here to welcome you on behalf of DCI and also to hand over the formal opening of the side event to Muhammad Atif Sheikh. Muhammad Atif he's leading the organization called STEP, the Special Talent Exchange Program. He's also representing SADF here, the South Asian Disability Forum. He works out of Pakistan, and he's been working in disability rights from the year of 1987. Very honored to have you here with us as partner, Atif. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Bhargavi, for the introduction. I'm very much excited to have this event happening at the COSP 14, and which was a long-awaited day for us. Indeed, let me give you a little background of the work we are doing. We are a cross-disability organization based in Pakistan, working for the rights of persons with disabilities for more than 2 decades. And we have been part of South Asian Disability Forum as one of the founding members. We are a collaborative partner of TCI Asia Pacific and part of the global networks on disability at different stages and the different thematic networks. We had a long struggle for the inclusion of persons with disabilities in the rights-based policies at the national, regional, and global level. We have been advocating at all stages to include people with disabilities in all the global decisions like the SDGs in disaster risk reduction, Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, and all of the international commitments. But there was one component which was less discussed, which was not given in due attention, and that was the inclusion of persons with psychosocial disability or people who are still invisible in the society. They are unheard, uncounted people in the society and the community. So we have to really work hard to include them. We are very much grateful to the COSP for giving us the space to have the discussion on this topic. And we are hoping that the all panelists who have given their time to join this side event, their deliberations will be very helpful for the effective decision making and will be definitely contributing to the policy making levels. So far, the situation, I will not go into the detail, but so far, people with psychosocial disabilities are totally out of the mainstream. Even when they're born or from very childhood, they are not part of any school system. They are just excluded without, people don't understand their issue and don't try to create an enabling environment for them because the issue is totally misunderstood. Ultimately, they remain out of the mainstream of the livelihood opportunities and the social lives. And people who are facing these psychosocial disability or living with this disability, they are still out of the main events of the society. So we have to work at the both we have to adopt a twin track approach. First, we have to create a space as to create the acceptance to the diversity, acceptance of the disability. On the other hand, we have to work with people with psychosocial disability, which at the platform of PCI Pacific we are already doing, to prepare them so that they can advocate about their rights. They can talk about their rights and instead of having a sympathy or remaining out of the mainstream. I would like to congratulate all the members of the organization who are supporting this side events, particularly TCI Asia Pacific, IDA, and the supporting partners, CBM, for giving us this opportunity to take up this discussion from here. And I'm very much, again, hopeful that in the coming days, in the coming months, when we will meet again in next COP, we will have some concrete steps to be celebrated, and the policies in our countries will be inclusive of people with psychosocial disabilities. Best of luck for all the panelists and participants of this meeting and supporters Over to you, Balram.
Thank you, Atif Bhai. TCI, STEP, IDA, and CBM, partners to this event, we value the opportunity this year within the United Nations to discuss the topic of deinstitutionalization in a very focused way. This discussion is happening everywhere. And now we are in the context of the CRPD Committee Working Group on Deinstitutionalization. So far, the discourse has been on all the abuse and violence and the inhuman, torturous treatments which happen within the institutional context. And most of the efforts have hinged upon legal and justice actions and changing the macro policy environment. These are, of course, very important to begin the process of deinstitutionalization, not to mention budgets, of course. But this side event is premised on this idea that we need lots and lots of programs at the community level to hold and support the process of deinstitutionalization. There have been so many examples recently in South Africa and over the years from many parts of the world, which suggests that unless communities are prepared for the inclusion of people who are deinstitutionalized, such efforts are likely to be leading to harm. Further, government must prepare for this process by releasing budgets, creating a safeguard policy, a compensation package, so on and so forth. Without further ado, I would like to introduce the panelists. Really excited for this event. DCI has waited long for this opportunity to bring people from different geographical regions to share what are they doing at the grassroots level. Today, a number of platforms are available for discussion on reforming the mental health system into something which is better than what it is today. But TCI believes strongly that a transformation and a paradigm shift is important. And that's why the name Transforming Communities for Inclusion. And thank you all for joining us. Introducing quickly the panelists, they have all given a decade or two to building community support systems. Community support systems, especially in the wake of the CRPD and inspired by the guidance and the vision of the CRPD. All identify as people with lived experiences, survivors, or persons with psychosocial disabilities. They are intensely involved in national advocacy over the years on the right to stay in communities and not be institutionalized. This means many things for the different programs, and we'll come to that in a bit. So long list of wonderful speakers who've been working in the field for a long time. Michael Jenga is the Executive Director of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry in Kenya. He's also a board member at the DRF and the Commonwealth Disabled People's Forum. Matrika Devkota is founder and director at Koshish in Nepal, a DPO working in community development using peer support principles and development principles for a long time. Karen Alexander is part of the Global Inclusion Advisory Group at CBM Australia. CBM Global Inclusion Advisory Group is a network of advisors who, in partnership with the disability movement, work to influence organizations, institutions, and systems to realize the rights of persons with disabilities. Karen is also a person with a lived experience and identifies as a person with psychosocial disability. Kavita Nair is Assistant Director in Capacity Building at the Bapu Trust for Research on Mind and Discourse, which works in low-income communities of Pune using peer support principles on the inclusion of persons with psychosocial disabilities. She runs probably the largest peer support project for the Asia-Pacific regions, if not for the Global South. Chris Hansen, Director of the Intentional Peer Support Group from the US, was in the New Zealand delegation to the CRPD in the drafting of it, contributed to developing several peer-run crisis respites in several countries and been advisory to commissions and departments in New Zealand. Her work has been on creating community links and relationships that people need to stay within communities and out of institutions. Kim Ting Tong from Thailand worked many decades in the peer support and recovery movement. Very senior advocate for human rights-based services in Thailand, very much involved in national advocacy at different levels, social protection, bringing recovery-based ideas into policy, so on. She's presently with the Living Association in Thailand, helping peers to stay in the community by taking up livelihoods such as bakery, urban farming, etc. Olga Runciman, an old friend and a wonderful guide and mentor to all people who hear voices. She's part of the Hearing Voices Network, been relentlessly, tirelessly active in bringing a different perspective and a paradigm shift to to people who hear voices. And her work is known worldwide as spearheading an alternative movement for people who hear voices and building peer support communities for holding those persons and away from institutions. So thank you all for joining us today. I'm really excited to be here with all of you, listening and learning from this side event. So Michael, thank you for being here with us despite your busy schedule. I would like to ask you, you have since long been involved in community development for the inclusion of persons with psychosocial disabilities. When everybody thinks of supported decision making as simply a legal issue, you have devised a peer-led support system in Kenya, which has the outcome of supported decision making for your communities. What is the practical way by which you were able to enable this in your communities? And is your model useful as a response to DI and the debates going on over there? Over to you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Bhagavi, and of course to TCI for the invitation to speak at COSP 2021. So I'm going to reflect a bit on the whole discussion around peer support in the paradigm of supported decision-making, and also around the whole debate of inclusion and the meaningful participation of persons with psychosocial disabilities. So I will start by saying that peer support has been said to help advance a view of autonomy and decision-making. It has many benefits and has been described as a pure form of supported decision-making, an important tool during emergency decision-making moments, and an integral part of recovery-based services and a source of valuable information about an extensive range of issues, enabling persons with psychosocial disabilities to make informed decisions. The relationship between peer support and the exercise of legal capacity, of course, looking at it in the context of supported decision-making, for persons with psychosocial disabilities in Kenya is multifaceted. On one level, there is a direct link between peer support and the making of certain decisions that have legal consequences. This is especially the case with regard to mental health treatment decision-making. So for example, during peer support group meetings, members get information from each other about the side effects of medication or of other therapies like electroconvulsive therapies. Members are also get information about human rights, including what others can or cannot do to you legally. Once members have this information, they are able to tell, for example, their doctors or their family members, I do not want to have electroconvulsive therapy, just to give an example. At a second level, the link between peer support and the making of decisions that have legal consequences is indirect. I mean, in these cases, peer support fosters agency and autonomy, which in turn boosts the exercise of legal capacity. In these instances, after attending peer support group meetings over a period of time, members start to reclaim their voice and to become more assertive. In part, this may be because they see other people who share similar experiences making their own decisions and being in control of their lives. In essence, the individual then goes out into the world with a different outlook as an empowered agent rather than an object of treatment. At a third level is autonomous decision-making, where peers assert that they do not always need to use peer support to make a decision. At this level, Sometimes peers have already made a decision and only present the decision to the peer support group to receive feedback on a decision which have already been made. This presents an uncoercive environment for decision-making, which reinforces individual autonomy as the decision remains that of the individual. And in other words, peer support then reaffirms the individual as the decision maker. Peer support enables members of the peer support groups to get into an optimal decision-making space of mind. And the peer support group members will bring a whole range of decisions for discussions during various sessions. This includes decisions related, for example, to mental health treatment, reproductive health, employment, education, access to services, both mainstream and disability specific, and also about relationships. This helps to frame the discussions beyond mental health, not to underscore, of course, the importance of discussing about comprehensive community-based mental health services, but rather looks into creating more inclusive spaces for persons with psychosocial disabilities. The focus on human rights-based approaches and inclusive development through the lens of the SDGs has been critical in ensuring participation and inclusion in a meaningful ways of persons with psychosocial disabilities in different spheres of their lives, whether it is in legislative reforms, access to economic empowerment programs, social protection, educational grants, inclusive mental health services, and also looking at the use of alternative ways of addressing distress. The strengthening of support services beyond the peer support groups, for example, tapping into circles of friends, working with the social capital in communities, and the recognition of the important role families plays in the lives of persons with psychosocial disabilities is critical in the realization of full and effective participation and inclusion in the society. We can also not underscore the continuous engagement with the cross-disability movement and also the mainstream human rights organization, and how this is strategic in creating allies that are crucial in advocating for just and inclusive societies for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. I think you've brought out the important point of looking at what peer support means in different cultural contexts. And I believe for the Global South, we depend a lot on peer support, going beyond the traditional model of peer support, including informal networks, friendships, people who occupy a position of vulnerability, not just of being diagnosed with a mental disorder and medicalization of persons' lives. Hope to hear more on this debate in the coming session. Now, just a housekeeping, there is for people who have asked about closed captioning, there is a little line right on top. It says live transcription has been enabled and who can see this transcript. And if you click on that, you should be able to access the transcript and the closed captioning services that is available. So if there are any further queries, you can just post it on in the chat box. And now I welcome Olga Runciman. For years, Olga, you have advocated and supported people who are seen by the system as lacking insight and needing institutionalization. Also, these are the people who come into the system when they are very young, hardly having a choice to explore their evolving capacity and to take the risks that only young people can. Can you share what should be available for people in families and communities, particularly for young people who hear voices? What is the significance of community living in your country context where institutionalization is fairly common for this group of people? Is there an effort to redefine or reclaim communities for persons who hear voices? And is that a inclusive space? Is it an inclusive community space? Over to you, Olga.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me today. I'm a voice here, and I'm part of the Hearing Voices movement, and we're actually a really large worldwide community of people because voice hearers are found everywhere, really. But our movement is active in about 30 countries. And common for most of us, or a lot of us in the West, is that psychiatry describes us as schizophrenic, and we're often seen as mad, bad, and lacking insight. And the results of this is many of our fellow sisters and brothers are being institutionalized also at a very early age. And certainly here in Denmark, where I come from, most of the people who can be found living in group homes are voice hearers. And in fact, in my country, more and more people are being defined as suffering from psychiatric diseases and illnesses, a situation which I think is very common in the West. De-institutionalization occurred here mainly in the 80s and 90s. It wasn't a great de-institutionalization, but it occurred. But there is unfortunately now a big push to reintroduce more hospital beds. And we are actually, and many of us, other big groups, we're trying to stop this and trying to, find community-orientated solutions. But we're up against quite big odds. And that's why I'd like to add here that there are new challenges appearing with regards to community-orientated enterprises and practices. The push to activate the community has actually resulted in psychiatry also moving out into the community, and bringing the language of psychiatry into the community has resulted in sort of a normalization that is really pervasive and insidious. And for example, we are increasingly seeing schools introduce classes specifically for those with psychiatric diagnoses, and thus creating sort of what we consider psychiatric ghettos out in the community. And young people are embracing diagnoses as explanations for difficulties in their lives. And, with actually very normal things that a lot of people experience. There's also, forced treatment. Before it used to exist within the walls of the psychiatric hospitals, and it's now moving out into the community. And by bringing forced treatment into the community, it's actually spreading a widespread sort of sense of fear for many, as the community is actually beginning to become a part of psychiatry. So despite these things, even in a country like ours, where the Western biomedical psychiatry dominates, there are many small initiatives, and we try and support and play a big part in well, not a big part, but as much as role we can. But for example, when you're defined as having a lack of insight, your right to making decisions are compromised and taken away. So we advocate for supported decision making, as it's a tool that allows people with psychosocial disabilities to retain their decision making capacity by being able to choose trusted others to help them and to make choices. In many places, like actually in my country, this document isn't legally binding, and it can be easy to dismiss. But in our experience, the fact that such a document exists, and the fact that there are people who are willing, to stand by the person in distress and put pressure on psychiatry, the system is more likely to listen to that person on whom they want to do something, and this something isn't what the person wants. Also here in Denmark, but also in many other countries, open dialogue is being embraced. And we in the Hearing Voices movement can see many overlaps. And for those who don't know about open dialogue, it's how Western Lapland created their psychiatric system based on the idea that dialogue within the network was the treatment and medication was a choice. And this approach parallels our Hearing Voices groups. And just to say a little bit about the groups, we try and create a safe space where we support each other to get off medication, find meaning, friendships. We are creating a community within ourselves here. So by joining forces with open dialogue, we are introducing the peer perspective, which we think is essential in supporting distressed others. And we're also introducing the concept of activism, which is something that traditionally isn't a part of the open dialogue movement, so that it can also become a more powerful voice for change. Safe houses and havens for people in crisis, they can also avert psychiatric admittance. For example, I'm working closely with one such place, and it's amazing to see the difference what a place like that can do, which doesn't see people as ill, but in a crisis. And by not involving psychiatry, but instead working actively with the crisis that people are coming with, this results many times in the person being able to return to their everyday with some tools, to move forward. And this is despite people are only allowed to stay a maximum of 5 days. Another solution, which we've also been involved in, is for people who are already institutionalized, sometimes for many years. It costs huge sums of money to have someone living in a care home. And if that money follows, what happens if that money follows the person instead? Here, the concept is the person is moving out of the institution and into an ordinary rental. And this releases large sums of money. And that money, they can choose to create a team who will be supporting them. It's their team, and also pays for money on their needed journey, for recovery, their recovery journey. We also have Sweden. I've always admired that their concept over there, that they had ordinary families which opened their homes to distressed others, and through the everyday brought about healing in a very natural way. And I remember once I met a mother from one of those homes who'd opened her doors or their doors, and who'd opened their doors, and she came up to me and said to me, "Wow, so that person that is living with us would be defined as schizophrenic by psychiatry." And she just couldn't unify the societal picture of schizophrenia with that wonderful person whom they were supporting. And she really thought of how important it is to meet the person and not the label. So these are also initiatives that highlight that choice and respect and dignity make all the difference. Yet, unfortunately, we continue to have a dominant paradigm which insists on a medical model for defining distress, and a system which sees disagreement with this worldview as lacking insight. And just like in the days of the Inquisition, there is an insistence that these people, my brothers and sisters, confess to and accept their illnesses and the ensuing chemical treatment. So I would be recommending any country that doesn't yet have Western psychiatry encroaching on their people to hold on to the concept of support in the community. Never allow institutions to become the norm. Fear of the mad here in the West has long been used as a tactic to isolate and separate. But the fact is that the so-called mad are no longer, they are no more to be feared than your neighbor. Yeah. So from the Hearing Voices movement, please hear our voices, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Olga. Finding meaning, friendships, relationships, having a haven to go to when overwhelmed, social protection, cash transfers, natural healing through alternative family arrangements, and basic acts of kindness and care which communities can offer. We will rely on these definitely for the Global South. Now passing the space over to Kim. Kim, you have pioneered peer support work in Thailand, recently linking peer support with climate change, food security, and livelihoods, social protection. You're working with peers on recovery and urban farming. What were your experiences in developing a peer community using natural methods of farming? Is this a useful response for de-institutionalization? Over to you, Kim.
Thank you, Bhargavi. Distinguished participants, greeting from Thailand. It is a great honor for me to be here sharing Living Association Thailand's groundwork to make the institutionalization a reality and a life worth living. With Thailand's social protection scheme, there is a ray of hope of the institution. There is though small amount of universal monthly disability allowance of 800 baht, about 2 days of minimum wages. We have universal healthcare coverage. We also have positive measures of employment scheme of 1% quota for persons with disabilities, free education up to undergraduate degree, and other concessions such as free sky and underground train traveling. Living Association, with the support of TCI, have played a part in making institutionalization unnecessary and living in the community possible through organic urban farming training project. which is a part of our vocational training as a response to COVID-19 pandemic, where people suffer from economic and social isolation. The aim was to create food security for persons with psychosocial disability in the urban areas in time of COVID-19 pandemic. We do the full cycle of organic farming, training, making organic fertilizers, organic pest repellents, soil enrichment, raising earthworms, and vegetable growing. We had to make platforms to grow the vegetables as the ground is covered with cement. We would plant the vegetable garden before the winter set in and the high buildings block the sunlight from our garden. We learned at the time to turn to growing seedling of morning glory and sunflowers for food and products for sale. In working in the garden, in the sun, all our participants found that they got healing of the mind and emotion. To see the plants go green and alive seemed to make some resonance with our wellness and happiness inside. Even our instructors were once depressed and also found healing in working their garden. So it was a peer-to-peer training. On a parallel stream, we did the empowerment and advocacy training along with vocational training. We acknowledge that we need to realize the rights as indicated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Thai Constitution, Thai's Person with Disability Empowerment Act, and Education Provision for Persons with Disability Acts and other laws and provisions, which we had forgotten that as a citizen we are and will always be eligible to. We need to reclaim our voice and be heard. Therefore, after we learn about the theoretical aspects, we put what we learn to practice by advocating for the quality of life of persons with psychosocial disability to the Committee on the Development, Social Development and Children, Youth, Women, the Elderly, the Disabled, and the Underprivileged Affairs of the Senate. In addition to human rights and advocacy, we also supported our participants with training in life skill and work skill. We know that to reclaim our lives from mental challenges is not easy. It has been a winding path of up and downs for many. There is a need to reclaim skills in living in the community as a citizen with full and effective participation. There were also other support for our participants in dealing with their issues in life, such as art therapy and music. Peer support has also been important in our movement. All the work done is mainly by persons with psychosocial disability, and the model of wellness and efficiency in work and the good heart have inspired our participants' hope and empowerment to find their own way from mental challenges and to wellness and to their own meaningful lives. From all aspects of our work, we become the resource for recovery in the community that residents, nurses, and nursing students and other professionals come to on study visits. And they reflect that what they see inspire them that recovery in the community is possible and beautiful. We have played a small part in the de-institutionalization, and we realize that we have to do more in terms of community involvement and promoting job coaches to support setting up our participants' business in the community. There is a long way ahead for us to go. Over to you, Bhargavi.
It's wonderful, Kim. Thank you for sharing. I really want to highlight the fact that your program, while being a small model for Thailand, you persistently take the model into the policy environment and engage different actors within governance, within the Thai governance, to listen and to make some new policies and to bring about change towards the inclusion of persons with psychosocial disabilities. I think it's a very important learning for our movement in the global south, but generally worldwide, that we use our models to advocate at our national level. Many of us have been doing this in this panel. Now coming to Kavita Nair, you have been long involved in creating what we call a zero coercion community inclusion program for persons with psychosocial disabilities, suitable for low-income communities. Can you list a few brief learnings from this? And I mean brief because we are already running out of time. How do you deal with crisis without resort to forced treatment or institutionalization? Over to you, Kavita.
Thank you, Bhargavi, and thank you, TCI Group, for the invitation to speak today. The Bapu Trust Community Mental Health and Inclusion Program is based on learnings from applying Article 19 in low-income urban settlements of Pune city in India. Community stakeholder groups play an important role in supporting persons with psychosocial disabilities, whether in enabling choice, supported decision making, or in providing individualized support. Support persons would be people from the formal and informal networks around a person. We call it the person's circle of care. They could be peers, grassroots support workers, community enablers, neighbors, local leaders, local authorities, just about anybody in their circle of care. Their contributions are not limited or restricted to conversations around treatment or hospitalizations, but are on a number of day-to-day aspects of daily life and living. Support actions include providing information, making information accessible, building relationships, providing personal assistance, support for independent living, making a daily plan, self-care plan. We have to be so imaginative in our conception of support people and support responses. To share an example, say a person exits from a mental hospital to open communities and is looking for housing arrangements. They may need assistance with visiting likely places of residence. They may require negotiating with the house owner on rent or deposit money. A peer or a grassroots support person can come in here to assist the person with the required information, be physically available with the person, support to make support and considerations available for taking a decision and translating decisions into actions. The support networks can also be mobilized to provide support in crisis, ensuring safety of the person, food and nourishment, shelter during the crisis period, setting up neighborhood alert systems. The informal networks can be roped in to look out for rights violation, and they either confront the family or caregivers directly, or they may provide respite support to the person, or they may alert the local authorities. Actions include peer support, enabling open dialogue, putting moral pressure on the caregivers, mobilizing community to confront the family, community confrontation meetings, enabling justice through community process and participation, using law or threat of law, or taking the help of the local police. They can provide many additional support responses to the person to tide through the crisis without the person having to be moved to a hospital or to an institution. In our experience, stakeholder groups within the person's formal and informal networks can be trained in skills for psychosocial inclusion. The capacity can be built to provide support actions. These actions, these transactions are non-monetary, but they do have an emotional quality. They are social transactions and a mutual give and take between the person and their circle of care. One has to be forthright in asking stakeholder groups, what can you do to include this person? To take the steps to develop relationships with every local actor in the community. This has enabled us in addressing many barriers averting forced treatment and hospitalizations. Through this, though they are all concerted actions and efforts, the locus of control is always with the person. The bottom line is that non-formal, non-specialized, non-expert stakeholder groups have immense potential for enabling and facilitating zero coercion inclusion responses in communities. When we work in partnerships with the person's networks, we are able to provide a wide range of support responses as accessible and available to the person. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that, Kavita, and thank you very much for keeping to the allotted time. It's really precious now as we move into the last part of the program. You have brought out that the fact that crisis is a dynamic between various social and cultural actors. And you have equally pointed out that using that very same social network to address rights violations is an important community micro action. Every actor, whatever the nature of the stakeholder group, could be a support person, and informing them and giving them the rights-based perspective and skill sets could lead to inclusion and prevention of institutionalization. Unfortunately, the Bapu Trust seems to be doing the government's job and taking all the costs. So it will be important in the future to understand how can cost be given over to the state, which holds the primary responsibility on inclusion. Really happy to welcome you, Chris. So for years, you have been working on capacity building for intentional peer support. Organizations like the Bapu Trust have learned from you over the years, and particularly in the inception stages. So thank you so much for that. What is specific about your model of peer support? We hear that peer support is appropriated by the medical paradigm. How has the experience been of global training experiences of creating communities in different cultural, demographic, and geographic contexts? Does your model address the topic of de-institutionalization? Over to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Bhargavi, and welcome. My name is Chris Hansen. I'm Director of Intentional Peer Support, which emerged in the mid-1990s. It was a convergence of the civil rights and self-help movements. The work of Sherry Mead, who was hospitalized and diagnosed with schizophrenia in her teens and decided to find ways for people who experienced extreme states and who would otherwise be hospitalized or incarcerated in the community to stay connected to one another, their families and communities. She developed the world's first peer-run respite, which is an alternative to psychiatric hospitalization, and started working with communities to learn to be present with and connect to one another when things get really rough, people get scared, and most people's reaction is to find ways to get out and to find someone else to deal with the situation, often coercively. And it's the coercion that often provides immeasurable damage, which is how I got into this work. Intentional peer support is about developing connected relationships that work towards mutuality, both giving and receiving, and are non-coercive. It works to provide supports within the community rather than reverting to hospitals and institutions and what Olga called psychiatric ghettos. In intentional peer support, relationships are viewed as partnerships that invite and inspire both parties to learn and grow, rather than as one person needing to help one another in an expert role. It doesn't start with the assumption of a problem, but each of us pays attention to how we have learned to make sense of our experiences and promotes a trauma-informed way of relating, looking for what happened, what's going on, rather than what's wrong, and encourages us to increasingly live and move towards what we want and what is possible instead of focusing on what we're afraid of or what we need to stop doing. Intentional peer support is principally about connection and being mindful about that. There are 3 principles which are all about shifting focus. The first is about shifting the focus from the individual to the relationship. How can we make this work for both of us? The second one is shifting the focus from helping me, helping you, to how can we learn and grow together? You've probably got as much, if not more, to teach and to contribute to me than I have to you. And the third, from fear to hope and possibility. And often it's through fear. And there are 4 tasks: connection. This is principal to IPS and is what much of the traditional system avoids. And forgets, and being mindful about disconnection and reconnection. How do I reconnect? Worldview, acknowledging that we are a sum total of our experiences of what happened and the lens that we learn to view the world through. The third task is mutuality. And this is hard for clinicians and people trained in traditional services to learn. It's hard to do actually when you're scared. It's about your worldview and my worldview both being present in the conversation, about me being able to talk to you about how this affects me, about a little bit about my story and what's going on for me, or a snippet. And but also about being prepared to ask for what I need. And then moving towards, which is really about being clear about what we are wanting and what is possible, rather than focusing on what we don't want, what we're afraid of, and what we're trying to stop. Intentional peer support, which started as one person's way of surviving and finding some way to live well, has really grown and is being taught and practiced in over 15 countries worldwide. US and Canada, Australasia, Europe, Japan, India, Taiwan, and some initial work is being done to make this accessible in some African nations. It is practiced by people in grassroots networks and organizations, people who are in peer support roles, both paid and unpaid, in a number of prisons, in LGBTQIA communities, with veterans and ex-military, and in hospitals and mental health services. It's been adopted as a statewide peer support model in a number of United States states where there's some peer support that is paid. And we're also working with a number of traditional mental health systems to create paradigm shifts in philosophy and practice, and are increasingly being asked to train psychiatrists, nurses, social workers, and other clinicians, although our heart is with the grassroots communities. We're also finding ways to work in partnership with open dialogue practices, and have been translated into half a dozen languages, and increasingly in demand in a growing range of demographics and cultures within different countries. When we're invited into a new group or culture, we invite members of the community to work with us to adapt and present what we do to build networks of people committed to building communities that will develop mutually supportive relationships and to the community and culture. We provide training, consultation, and support. And over the pandemic, this has been increasingly provided online as an option, which has made it more accessible in many places, both geographically and financially. People work together one-on-one in groups and practice what we call co-reflection, which is a way of reflecting on their practice of intentional peer support and considering what they might have done differently or need to do in order to reconnect or move forward. Peer support and community inclusion are powerful when communities are connected and they're working together. And I'll finish with a quote. As peer support in mental health proliferates, we must be mindful of our intention, which is social change. It is not about developing more effective services, but rather about creating dialogues that have influence on all of our understandings, conversations, and relationships. Thank you so much for this work, which is really what communities have done for generations, but many of us have forgotten. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that amazing presentation, Chris. Not to have social connection disrupted. I think in many ways, all of us around the world, particularly those of us who are involved in our movements, are really struggling to just say the simple fact that we need our social networks, we need our friendships, we need our relationships, and so don't take them away from us. And your presentation was so rich in the number of things that we can do. And so thank you so much for bringing all those nuanced elements of our interconnectedness and how we can sustain, preserve, and conserve those aspects. And that is our sense of community. Thank you so much for that. Now coming to Matrika, now I will start to appeal strongly that we keep to time. We have another 10 minutes. I hope so that we will take some questions. Matrika, legal incapacity has been the bane of community inclusion. Many lawyers are involved in legal reform. What can happen at the community level to tone down the impact of legal incapacity while we wait for laws to reform? Do you see the use of legal reform as a way to build inclusive communities? Will the recognition of full legal capacity prevent institutionalization? What efforts have you made in Nepal to advocate for the removal of this very big barrier found all over the world? Over to you, Matrika.
Greeting from Nepal. Thank you, Bhargavi. Thank you, all distinguished participants. A person with a disability, especially psychosocial disability, and we are facing different types of barriers. And one of them major barrier is legal barrier, like our civil right, political right, and economic right are being violated, like disqualified from being, in any part of life. And also political right is taken out, and also like the employment and not allowed to be employment contact act, like this such kind of all the barrier perspective. And what we are trying is from our self-help group and peer support, I'm bringing that this discriminatory provisions legal side in one part, and another part is like the international human rights treaties that the Nepal has ratified, including Convention on the Right of Persons with Disabilities, and according to Nepali legal system, according to Treaty Act, and if international human rights treaty is ratified by the Parliament, and in domestic law and international law that conflict, the international law exists. So from our peer group, we're trying that this discriminate laws in one hand and other positive provision from the conventions, human rights other side, and then we are informing to the duty bearer, parliamentarian, bureaucracies, and commissioner, judiciary system, and this is the violation of human right, and thus the even by the law, we are not treated as a person. So we are informing to duty bearer, like our peer are doing this, master this thing. And also we have a public interest litigation that people is that we can file that case, and recently we have filed case for the voting right, and we have also filed case for the abolishment of this discriminatory provision for person with psychosocial disability. And also like we are involved in concluding observation of the 19th session of CRPD in 2018. So we are involving that, and also universal periodic human right. So we are raising this issue, and our voice has been coming up, and it also has been because of this legal provision discriminatory. Other hand, we have a new Disability Right Act progressively in line with CRPD. So we are empowering the community peer and and demanding and fighting for the barrier. We have CRPD and making the rights real, and we are using the human rights treaty standard. And so like we in the community that until unless the barrier and rather than person having problem, barrier are the more. So we are working against the barrier with a peer-based model and claiming the disability right, making the rights real. Thank you, Bhargavi, for this opportunity sharing.
Thank you so much, Matrika, for finishing well before time. Thank you so much. I request, would the interpreters would like to change? Amrish, would you like to hand over to your colleague? Must be tiring.
I'm fine. We alternate every 20 minutes, so I still have another 5-10 minutes to go. Not an issue.
All right. Okay. Thank you. So questions in the question answer boards. I still hope that we will have time for questions. And so the last speaker for the event is very happy to welcome Karen Alexander from CBM Inclusion Advisory Group in Australia. Karen is a support agency working extensively with several stakeholders, partners, cross-disability movement, BPOs and donors. How do you see these grassroots initiatives within the larger frame of investments for creating inclusive communities? Each of us here have emphasized the fact that community inclusion is about developing communities outside of all the other services that are available to different people with disabilities from healthcare. We should really look at creating inclusive communities as a distinct area for investment of creation of knowledge and practice. So what key learnings can we advocate for influencing the influencers and the investors on community support services? Over to you, Karen. Karen, we can't hear you. So while we wait for you, Karen, would you like us to take the questions? Could check your sound system, test the microphone.
I've checked it. Can you...
Oh, there you are. There you are, yes.
So sorry. So sorry. Okay. Thank you so much. And it's really great to be here and a privilege to be here and follow such amazing speakers. So donors recognise that social inclusion is fundamental to achieving their development goals. They recognise that to achieve social inclusion and leave no one behind, tackling the exclusion of certain groups is essential. However, there are some challenges that have limited investments by donors to date. Knowing how to select the right initiatives to invest in and addressing mechanisms for investment in grassroots initiatives, concerns regarding the capacity of grassroots groups and reticence to fund capacity building, the misconception that inclusion and positive change for people with psychosocial disability is difficult to support and measure. We have some suggested strategies for increasing investment. Firstly, to develop partnerships that create space for the voices of people with psychosocial disability. Too often, the voices of smaller local organisations, including OPDs, are not heard on the international stage or by donors. Investments in psychosocial disability to date have been small and concentrated in northern medical models of health service delivery, which some evidence shows have perpetuated human rights abuses. This focus has been to the detriment of investment in supports required to realise the rights of people with psychosocial disability across all community contexts. Underestimating the capacity of people with psychosocial disability and a tendency for mental health professionals to speak on their behalf means they are rarely consulted or included in governance mechanisms that impact on their rights. Recently, the Bapu Trust model that Kavita presented on tonight was profiled in the Differed Position paper on mental health and psychosocial disability. We think this achievement offers some good learning on what works in attracting donor attention. For example, TCI's approach to developing strategic partnerships with CBM and other international organisations has enabled them to mobilise a number of networks and entry points to create greater voice and visibility of the Bapu Trust model, alongside other good practice supports and services. This has included harnessing resources to support keynote speaker positions for people with psychosocial disability at international, national and regional conferences. Integrating approaches into advocacy we are doing with larger INGOs, donors and UN agencies on inclusion principles, the CRPD and human rights. Using advisory networks to create space for people with psychosocial disability, and profiling case stories of community support models and policy-making platforms. Demonstrating to others a willingness to collaborate with less official representative networks and self-help groups. Co-writing journal articles and blogs. We think that a combination of all these things can contribute to exposure to donors and create an enabling environment for uptake. Another key way to enable donors to assess their investments and prioritise good practice examples is to provide resources on the CRPD and other human rights tools to demonstrate how they will assist states and donors to meet their obligations. The CRPD was developed by and for people with disabilities. It is a key tool from which to establish policy directives. For example, the European Fundamental Rights Association developed policy indicators to assess compliance with Article 19 of the CRPD. The European Parliament subsequently used those indicators to withdraw funding of institutional care for people with disabilities. Linking advocacy messages and proposals to INGO's increasing commitment to localisation. Investment in social inclusion requires supporting local grassroots initiatives which build community support services responsive to and driven by those who are most affected. Donors can at times see investing in grassroots initiatives as risky. Strategies that seek to change systems and advance equity can create conflict and challenge powerful individuals and institutions. So INGOs and OPDs need to understand the risks the donor is weighing up and how to highlight value for money and align outcomes with aid effectiveness narratives to help them rebalance those risks. INGOs can bridge this gap by supporting emerging models, funding pilots, and supporting scaling of good practices. And finally, contribute to the evidence base. Donors are likely to place greater emphasis on those services that have a body of evidence behind them. Medical trials are easier to do this with, and there is very little peer-reviewed literature from the Global South compared with the Global North. It is important that new supports and services are linked to existing evidence and/or include research partnerships which can support action-based research methods and contribute to the evidence base. So these are just a few of the key learnings we have to share on how to enable investment in grassroots initiatives and social models of support. In summary, we have compiled a list of recommendations for different actors, and I'll copy them into the chat box because I want to make sure there's time for questions for the other panelists. Thank you so much.
That was amazing, Karen. Thank you so much for bringing up this idea that if we want Article 19 to be realized, then we need laws, but we also need budgets and donor interest, if not investments. And the point that you talked about for dilemma for the investor, because there may not be research evidence, investing in the grassroots is risky, so on and so forth, compels us to write more, publish more, and take our programs to governments and to academia. And we would definitely request from various donors and stakeholders supporting us for technical support, research support, and of course, grants and foundations should be looking at Article 19 and grassroots community support systems creation as an important area of investment. Some of us working in peer support face the dilemma of letting go of the medical model for fear of not having funding to continue our work. To move from the medical paradigm to social paradigm, long-term support programs like those featured here definitely have measurements and programmatic features. It's just that there is not enough time to write about all of this and take it to the next level of policy making. I hope forums like this will ensure that lots of people are listening and lots of people will have interest in supporting some of the programs here and so many others outside of this space. Now we can take some questions. Please put them in the question answer box. There are a few already. Thank you for those recommendations, Karen. So the first one, I have a question for Michael. How peer support can help to reduce the negative stereotyping and stigma against persons with mental health issues and psychosocial issues in your experience?
Thank you very much, Bhargavi. I think for me, what is important is sort of the peer support group, of course, to reframe the conversation towards how we address systematic barriers, challenges, discrimination, and social exclusion that might be faced by persons with psychosocial disabilities in different contexts. So we have to really shift from, for example, the over-reliance on the biomedical model and shift more towards a narratives of full and effective participation and inclusion of persons with psychosocial disabilities. I think fundamentally or equally important is how we restore voice, power, and choice to persons with psychosocial disabilities within different contexts, so that they're able to contribute to different initiatives at the community level. And I think lastly, peer supports building strategic relationship with other actors within their communities, with, for example, national human rights institution, with traditional or religious leaders. I think that for me is very important towards also addressing some of the systematic challenges that might be faced by people with psychosocial disabilities at the grassroots level. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. There are some questions which are being answered live, and feel free, all panelists, if you'd like to add to those answers, you could answer them as well. This one was specifically for Michael. There is a question on elections, legal capacity, and Nepal. So, Matrika, would you like to answer this?
Thank you very much. Still, in the paper, and we are not allowed to vote, person with psychosocial disability, but practically in the ground, so there are not such restrictions. So, but still in the legal framework of the election-related act, that person with psychosocial disability are not eligible to vote and also to be the candidate both. Still in paper, so we are working that we have filed case in the Supreme Court for dismissal of this provision.
Yeah, thank you so much, Matrika. IFES has been quite active in our regions, encouraging DPOs to pick up the issue of right to vote. So several organizations are working on that, including Sri Lanka and so on. Yeah, so there's another one from Edith requesting Spanish translation or a transcript with Spanish. So perhaps we can organize for a transcript which is in Spanish. We will explore the options, Edith, and come back to you. Definitely the video will be available online. Anita, how do we progress in providing accommodation and other basic needs for people with psychosocial disability, as many fall through the cracks of the system and end up homeless once their caregivers pass away? Hence, why many live in institutions too, once the interventions are given? What is your advice for us so that we can help better with minimal funds and the supports that we have? Yeah, so anybody from the panel, would you like to answer to this question? This comes from Anita. The issue of homelessness, not having caregivers or a support system once parents pass away or caregivers pass away. And this is the reason why there are institutions. So how can we help this population, and what can we do in this regard? Anyone?
I can briefly respond to that. I think this is challenging because it involves some action at a political level, policy-wise. There does need to be some funding somewhere, and it also involves people at the grassroots level. Where we are, we're in the United States, so we're in the global north, but we have mutual aid networks, which are community groups that popped up with COVID, that dedicated themselves to supporting one another, and there was a lot of food insecurity where we lived, so they'd go out to farms and take leftovers and work with people. And so what I can see, and it's not happening, but I could see that if there was some funding available from the organizations and policymakers who were encouraging de-institutionalization to fund some of these grassroots community groups so that they could stay afloat, they can get transport, they can pay for supplies, and also for some resources to enable them to think about how they do the work, which is some of what we provide. We just provide some tools around working with people in ways that keep both people in the relationship, so it works for both. I think that's really really helpful, and I think part of the reason it's so difficult everywhere is because it is this multi-layered approach. And it's really hard to advocate for that from the grassroots. It really needs allies in some of the advocacy that's been spoken about in both systems and politically.
Thank you so much, Chris, for that response. I see that there are a number of other questions, but Waqar here has alerted me that we have just 4 minutes left. I'd like to now hand over the space to Waqar Puri from TCR. Thank you so much for the amazing work you did with the side event, Waqar. And so before you thank everyone else, let me thank you for all your hard work to bring us all together and to work continuously with us. Over to you, Waqar.
Thank you, Bhargavi. I would like to start with the vote of thanks, honorable panelists, respected guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is my privilege to have been asked to propose a vote of thanks for this important side event. So my name is Waqar, and I'm representing Transforming Communities for Inclusion. Institutionalization is one of the key barriers towards inclusion of persons with psychosocial disabilities in the community. And I think it is extremely important to synergize the national policies in compliance with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, with the support of government institutions and non-governmental organizations, including the civil society organizations and organizations of persons with disabilities. So on behalf of TCI, I would like to extend a very hearty thank to all partners, including International Disability Alliance and CBM, for being our long-term partners for the inclusion of persons with psychosocial disabilities. I want to thank all panelists and participants for taking out time for this side event during the occasion of the 14th session of the Conference of the State Parties, and express on community-led interventions, human rights-based services, and practices of inclusive communities for people with psychosocial disabilities. I want to express my special gratitude to and thank Special Talent Exchange Program, STEP, for this partnership and hosting this side event. I thank STEP for its support through cross-disability interventions and taking the agenda forward of diverse inclusion in development through involving people with psychosocial disabilities in their programs. I thank especially our support persons, the sign interpreters, Amaresh, Basila, and Mary with captioning for the event. And you can write us on our contact emails in the chat box for any questions or queries related to the side event. Have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you all and have a good season, COSP season. It's not like being physically present, but it's brought so many more of us together online. Thank you so much and have good sessions forward. Thank you, Atif Bhai, and thanks everyone. Bye.